So with our weights imported back on here, and I've had to create a new rig pose. Unfortunately, deleting the skin cluster there deleted my rig pose, so not a big deal. So to rig pose, we're going to bring the arms back up here. Put this in prettier viewing mode here. Now, looking at our hands values here, now that we've flattened off the arm, the hand looks fairly flat, and our joint orient values are showing that it is. It's close to 90 here on its tilt from the upper arm. Now, if it's visually off a little bit, could have more to do with our alignment of our cube here. Let's see what these other channels got for us here. I'll leave that last one in there. Level it off. That's pretty good. It looks more like this first finger here. It was a little bit depressed. It was a little pointed downward there. That's probably why it's looking a little not flat from that view. But we're flat to where we created that cube. And we're going to want to keep this aligned more or less, the hand pointing with the world to be world aligned. But at the same time, I want to, and you should really do these in tandem with the left and rights, or at least use values that are close enough that you can replicate them on the other side, even if it's a 180 minus that value, because you want to have the exact identical thing right and left here. So in this case, we're going to want a little bend in the arm here, but not too much. So I want to actually bring these arms, lengthen these arms a little bit. And if you'll notice, I'm using this world axis line to sort of hit the shoulder and wrist spots here. Not totally required, it's just sort of a nicety, I guess. And we'll point those down in the world. Now, they don't have to be perfectly aligned. I mean, if you want to take it to that degree, be my guest, but it's not necessary. It's more that they're close. How'd that attribute editor get back in there? So now that we've adjusted those hands, we're going to click rig pose again to store another one. It asks us just to make sure that we're not accidentally clicking that and overriding something. So say yes. Now we can pop back to our bind pose or to our rig pose here. And so let me just have a quick once over. Now, we're not evaluating the skinning or anything like that. I mean, other than making sure it's not ridiculous. Hopefully you checked your you did a good job of evaluating your skinning earlier, whether you were setting keyframes, going through some range of motion. I don't know, looks pretty decent. So we now have a pose that we can start laying out our rig from. And when you store that rig pose, use the rig pose storage button. It does a rotation freezing of your joints for you. It basically moves all the joint orient values, or moves any rotation values into the joint orient fields, so that you're left with a clean skeleton. And this is one of the nice things about the DAG pose node, is that popping back and forth between a bind pose and a rig pose. It doesn't just change rotation values. It really stores your whole transforms coordinate system setup. So joint orients can change, rotation values can change, scales can change. Basically, whatever, however it is set when you create a DAG pose node for your skeleton hierarchy. What I'm doing is I'm creating this to get the joints. Normally, you cannot just go modify freeze transforms and freeze transforms the rotations on your joints. It'll complain. So, like if I were to rotate this and then say modify freeze transforms rotations on there, it does not apply because it is joint and has a skin attached. But what you can do, what the freezing a joints transform does normally, like if I were to just draw a dummy joint change here and we rotate it in some fashion, freezing its rotation transforms really just moves the values into the joint orient. So it's not going to screw up that joint's orientation to have its values set like that while it's skinned. But Maya complains about it, so behind the scenes this creates a little dummy node that orients itself to the joint, therefore providing XYZ values. I zero the joint out and those values are placed right back into the joint orient field and providing you a clean starting point. Because our FK skeleton is going to be built off of these joints, it's nice to have a cleaner starting point where we have rotations that are zeroed out. We also know our skeletons return to either a rig pose or a bind pose when we look at it and we see our values zeroed out. Certain game engines, actually, I just started playing around with the CryEngine 2 a little bit, and that has they require their joints to have rotation values on them, or at least the plugin exporter for Maya to it does. And so in the gnomon-rigging.mel file, there's actually a little unfreeze joints procedure that'll do the opposite of that, moving the joint orient values into the rotation fields and zeroing those out. So in the rare case you need it, you can always reverse that process. But by default, these tools are going to freeze out your joints rotation values for you when you store a rig pose. And with our rig pose created, we're willing to accept this as a point where we're going to continue. We can move on with the actual creation of the rig now. So we now have a system where we can go between our bind, where we skin our character, and our rigging T-pose. So that makes it real easy for us to go back to bind pose, and we will later add influences for twist joints or roll joints for forearms and our upper legs. Currently we do not have those joints in there, we just have this straight joint. So when this joint twists on its x-axis, it's going to get some rather harsh rotation in the hip area. I mean, that's not going to look very good, and we need to gradate that twisting off with the roll joint. Or you can use the dual quaternion skinning, and that'll have a largely similar effect in that area. But anyways, this T-pose has become sort of an industry standard. It sort of started as the standard in what pretty much, and you don't have to rig your character in a T-pose, but production rigging is all about having standards and sticking to them and developing a pipeline and having methods. And the T-pose is a good choice because it enables your hands and feet to become world aligned, so values start there, and all your characters, if they conform to this pose, you can transfer animation easier between control rigs. There's always retargeting and stuff, but the more you stay to some standard, the easier it is for you to stay fluid and easily transfer animation, swap out models as characters change throughout production. And it's just, the more methodical you can be and plan out what you're doing, the more hassle you save yourself down the road. And basically productions are going to be built on top of what you're doing as far as animation goes, and you're sort of responsible for being the custodian of the fact that everything's working or should be working, and you don't want to hose yourself. Applications like Motion Builder, their rigs start from T-pose. If we were going to use this character in Motion Builder with mocap data, we could then just take the skeleton out from its T-pose straight into Motion Builder and have a nice clean start to work from. There's just multiple reasons, but regardless, having this bind and rig pose association is a nice way to operate. So let's get going here with creating our control rig. Now that we have our deformation skeleton, it is so important that your deformation skeleton be correct, that joints are properly aligned. Use dummy cube objects if you need to in areas. Really take your time to make sure that what you got is proper. Everything else from this point is going to be built off of that to some extent, and you'll end up just having to tear it all down to basically this base level again if you find that you've messed a portion up, so definitely pay attention to what you've got as far as your joint alignments, joint orients, what your rotation values are. Like here, positive rotation, we've chosen Z. Ignore my sloppy skinning here for now. This is sort of just good enough that we get some visual on what we're doing here, but that could definitely be, time could be spent on our skinning for sure. But this being a rigging DVD more than a skinning DVD, let's get to it. So we have this body joint that's going to be our move our character all around joint. I should skin those eyeballs and heels in there, but and then we have our pelvis and spine as our next two branches off. We're going to want to make controllers for our character. Control joint, well, I call it a control joint or a control. A joint's really just a transform, and when we make a control, we'll use this button right here on the shelf, create a controller joint from our regular joint. And what that does is it makes a new joint here with a body, this body control, and it has this body underscore group node. I call this this is like it's basically an offset group. Joints can't have their translations frozen out. So by giving it a new parent that sits right in the same spot, our joint will be zeroed out. And because this is the joint animators are actually going to be animating on, it's nice to always have an easy way to return to bind pose and have all your controls start at a zero number. Makes it real easy to zero out rigs, get stuff back to bind, or rig pose at least, not necessarily bind pose, but the base animation state of any character rig, which is what we want. So that little button will create a constraint, point and orient, and connect in some scale connections. Let me unlock this. It also locks it out, just so it can't be messed with at that point. But we'll use our little unlock button here on the shelf to unlock it. We can see that we got a point constraint, an orient constraint, and then we got some connections to our scale, to our coming from our control. And so we got full control over our deformation skeleton, but this is going to be this is basically the start of our animation rig. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this body group and I'm going to group it twice. I'm going to name this base group root control. This is or you could call it character control too. It's your or placement control. It's basically your character's a way to move your character and get them placed in the scene. You may be importing animation data that is relative to some origin position, but the actual scene that's taking place is somewhere else in the world. This gives you a nice way to easily just move your rig around no matter what. It's the top level. And then I'll give it another one here. This is sort of like a root 2 control. At work we call this the translate control. This is just another node. It's really not necessary, but you could layer in another one if needs be. It could help potentially counter some animation situation. It's just a little safety buffer. That node could easily be added in later after the fact. So it's not totally necessary. It's more of a convenience factor, but a rig could easily be updated to have additional root offsets if needs be, or root placements. And then this will be the basic origin of where an animator would start their character animation, is off this body control. They would the root would ideally be used to place the character somewhere, and then the animation could be done here. So, if an animator did a walk cycle of their character going forward on Z, but then that animation needed to be used somewhere where the character is walking into some doorway that's off, placed in their set differently, the root control could be rotated, and then the character's just walking forward in that direction. Simple. Just changing that character space. I'm going to skin these eyes so I don't have to look at them moving around. I want to keep moving this thing. So